Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we took a look at integration testing. Specifically, we took a look at integration testing from the point of view of how our components are going to be coming together in our UI layer. And it's more of a white box approach because we get access to the internals like the DB context, which we can use to check stuff if it occurred correctly. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at a different approach where we're going to spin up a little server with our application and make requests to it. And this is a framework provided by Microsoft and their ASP.NET Core team, okay? And we're still going to do this in the voting system.integration.tests project. So let's go ahead and close this voting.tests class, and here I'm going to create a separate project. Again, we are going to be testing the voting. It's just going to be a different approach and how we do it, okay? And it's going to be a little bit more involved because here we're essentially going to try to simulate our UI. So we can create a folder like UI, and in here we can create a voting tests. Okay, .cs. The first thing that we want to do is we want to inherit from an iClass fixture. And this is primarily taken from Microsoft's documentation, and this is my interpretation of these classes. So iClass fixture. It comes from XUnit, and this is something like I will set up a class for you, or I will use a class as kind of a setup as a background for this test. And in here we're going to provide a type that then Microsoft gives us. And this type essentially says, I will do the same thing that this program.cs does in your UI. So I will build your application and I will run it. Instead of running it and you accessing it through a UI, it will build a client for us, which we can then use to access it. And we'll show how this works in a second. But essentially, this will accept some kind of a class, and this class happens to be Web Application Factory. And if we want to import this, we'll have to install package Microsoft ASP.NET Core.mvc.testing. So let's go ahead and install this. We can click on Find and Install Latest Version, and here it is. Okay, and this also accepts a type. In here we want to provide a startup class. So here we want to access this startup. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to my dependencies and include voting system.ui and press OK. So once I have access to this, I'm gonna go to voting system.ui.startup, and here now I have access to this class. So what this gives me is essentially I can create a constructor where I can now inject this type that I have specified of iClass fixture, and we can call this factory. And again, this is mostly taken from the Microsoft's documentation, which I'm going to link in the description. We can then create a property, and what this class allows us to do is to spin up a client which will have access to a running instance of our UI, okay? So we're gonna dip our toe real subtly with just getting a page and viewing it, and then we're gonna unpack a complicated example again with the voting. And by the way, just before we begin, this class can be used to sort of extend the setup for your testing, same way as, for example, for not in startup but in CS, we have this bit where we configure the services and we can add extra configuration in here. The same way we can extend this class or make a wrapper of this class and do our additional extensions on the application that we're about to spin up. So we can add additional services, see stuff in the database, etc. Let's go ahead and create a bit of a mock-up test, right? We're just gonna get a little bit of feeling around this whole testing framework, okay? So let's go ahead, not public void, but rather task, and we're just gonna call this an onGet. So primarily what we want to do is just create a client. So when we say factory, create client, so what this will do is it will create a client which we can access our application. And iClass fixture is going to create a single instance of your application. So it's going to spin up one server for this whole class. So all the methods in this class are going to run against one instance of your application. So you're going to have separate clients in every method, but you're going to have one application for the whole class. Here we have a client which can act like a browser or a mobile device or even on Postman, so we can make requests and stuff like that to our application, and it's automatically aimed at our application. Okay, so you can see that it's just an HTTP client. So what I want to do is I want to just go ahead and hit the index page, okay, and I will just inspect it. So let's go ahead and say response here, and for our client we will just get async and we will go to the index page. Or we can just hit the slash, okay, because the index page is going to be there. Okay, and because this is async, we'll have to await on this. Let's clean this up a little bit. So we have the response, and this is just an HTTP response method. Let's go ahead and grab the HTML. So on our response, we're going to go ahead and go into content, and we're going to read a string async. So we're going to read everything that's in there as a string, okay? And this is just going to be HTML. And for our assert, we can just say that this is not null or something, just because we don't really need an assert here. We're just figuring out how to use this thing, okay? Let's put a breakpoint here, and again, if you want to figure something out, put breakpoints everywhere, run the application on debug mode, and see step by step what is happening. So let's go ahead and right click on this and debug tests. Okay, so here we are. So if I hover over the client, I will see it's a normal HTTP client. If you're not familiar with HTTP clients, don't pay attention too much to this. What we want to take a look at the response. We can see that the status code is okay, or 200, so it has succeeded. We can take a look at the headers, and then here the results view. So we can see that there are some cookies that are being set for the form where we're gonna be submitting our voting poll. So for example, this set cookie here is basically a header that is returned to the browser, which tells the browser, yo, you need to set this cookie, okay? And it's the anti-forgery cookie, all right? We then have X-frame options, whatever. Some headers that are being passed, okay? And for the HTML that we have read right here, we can inspect the whole thing. It's literally the form generated, and the request verification token, which is our anti-forgery token, is registered here, which is actually a two-part, but we'll find out a little bit more about that in a minute. You can see that essentially we have a client that is pointing to a server, okay? We did not have to specify any addresses or anything like that. We have to specify a route within our application, and it goes ahead and gets that route. And then, like a normal HTTP client, we want to view the data that's returned, because we're in a C# application rather than a browser like Chrome, Edge, or Firefox, where this result is interpreted automatically and displayed in a nice little window for you. Here, you have to extract it manually, and then all you do is you get a string, which you can then parse and do stuff with, okay? And we'll get into that. But essentially, this is it. This is the whole principle. You have an application in which you can call into using this client. So what we want to do is we want to simulate creating a vote. And again, we will do a little seed for our application where we're going to seed the voting poll first. And then we're going to call into the vote and make sure that the vote is being saved to the database. And again, this is going to be a little bit of that gray box testing. So we're going to be looking at the database, but interacting through input-output. Is basically a little bit of everything, just so we know that the application is working. Whatever we need to test to make sure that the application is working, we're going to do that. Let's go ahead and create a post request. We have a client. We're going to take this step by step, and we're going to try to set this up and logically follow what we want to do and how to do it. So usually what we do, let's go ahead and take a look at our poll. We have a poll that is being displayed, so we will need some poll in the database, and we have an anti-forgery token, all right? So we will need to somehow grab that anti-forgery token, and you saw in the headers and in the HTML body that we just looked at that it is going to be there in the response. So we will have to write some logic for grabbing it, okay? But essentially we will have a form which we will then need to submit to the backend, where we will have a counter ID, which is submitted as part of the form, okay? And the method is post. So let's start with that. Let's try to replicate this form that we're going to submit. And because it's quite an easy example, it's just an ID. Let's go ahead and do that. So with the client, we want to go ahead and just post async. And we're going to be posting to /poll because that's where the onPost action is. It's under the poll model, okay? We're trying to hit this function. So now we want to post some content. If we F12 onPost async, we'll see some HTTP content that is required here. If we hover over the HTTP content and we essentially just F1 it, what will happen is you will open the documentation where you can then see what classes inherit from it, okay? Because it's an abstract class, we can't create an instance of it. And you can go ahead, take a look around, take a look at what these classes are, because some of them are actual implementations that you can implement, but what we're essentially looking is for byte array content and form URL encoded content. Okay, so this form URL encoded content is essentially how the form is represented when we submit it from our HTML page. Okay, this is how the browser encodes it, but it's a C# version of that. So let's go ahead and create our form. We're going to have a new form URL encoded content. We are going to need a namespace of system.net HTTP. And in here, let's go ahead and see what it needs. It needs a IEnumerable list of key value pair, string, string. So how our form looks with the name and then the value that we submit. Let's go ahead and see what we need. In the poll right here, the name is counter ID. So let's go ahead and create our new array. And in here, in this new array, we can create a new key value pair of type string, string. And the constructor for this, if we hover over this or maybe press F12 to navigate, it's T key and T value, right? So we can specify the two types, and then the constructor essentially accepts those two types as parameter in the constructor to instantiate this object or struct in this context. So we have the counter ID, and the ID will be 1. Again, we'll just be voting for the first counter that we're going to create, and we're just going to seed the same counter that we've seeded twice before, okay? And we'll convert this one to a string. Okay, so this is one parameter of a form. Let's go ahead and pass this form to our post async. So we create a client. We are essentially creating a form to vote for a counter that's not yet in the database. So let's go ahead and seed the database first, so we know that we actually have a counter that we can vote for. So the way we bring up our DB context in this function is something similar to how if you've ever seen me do seeding for the database in program.cs, it's essentially the same, it's a similar process. So we're going to create a using var scope, and we're going to essentially create a scope for which a service should exist, okay? So if it's a transient, it's only going to exist here. If it's a per request, depending on the request, this will be the only request that it will exist in. And then if it's a singleton, we're going to keep getting the same service in the scope. So we're going to grab the factory, and then we're going to go into services, and we're going to create scope. We're not going to get a little IntelliSense here because we will need a package Microsoft extension dependency injection. And this is typically the case when you're writing this bit of code. You sort of know the functions there, but you know you're just missing the package. But yeah, we create a scope for where a service will exist, right? Because outside of our application, we only have a client that's sort of going to hit the application. We don't have the actual application, and we cannot inject anything into the test. So we need to get access to the scope of the application, all the scope that is essentially of the services, where the services exist, okay? So when we spin up the application, all the services start existing. We can get access to the scope of our application, where the services exist, and here we can use them now in this function. Let's go ahead and grab our database, right? Database, or let's call it CTX. Let's be consistent. Scope, we're going to go into service provider, and we're going to get required service, and we're going to get our app DB context. I believe that's what we called it. Yep, using voting system.database. And now we have our context. All we have to do now is do the same thing that we did before, is essentially just add a new voting poll to our database. So let's go ahead and grab this. Let me close the poll CS.html. In my context, I will go to voting polls, and I'm going to add a new voting poll. I believe I will need that semicolon there, or I actually will. Let's go ahead and grab our imports, and let's not forget to save changes async, right? Save changes. Do we need to? We don't really need to do async because this is just a test. Okay, we're seeding a voting poll, and we're going to be voting for the voting poll. Let's go ahead and run this and see if we need anything else. All right, so let's go ahead again. Right click here, and let's debug this. So as well here, you can have a little bit of think about what you're actually expecting to see from the response before running it, and kind of have a few predictions. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the response, and we get a 400. Now this may look familiar to you, and you can basically look around the code and see what's happening, but if you remember the issue that we run into 3 times for 400, it's essentially the verification token, okay? So we're missing a verification token, and it just returns a 400, okay? So our primary goal right now is to essentially just to be able to hit that endpoint, is to attach the verification token to our request here, okay? What we'll need to do is first request this page, because when we request the page, the poll page, when it gets rendered, this is when the anti-forgery token gets put in there, okay? And that's when we're going to extract it, save it, and then when we do the post, we will need to add it to our post. So let's close that, and we'll use our client here to first, let's split this up a little bit because it is getting a little bit messy. We will say that this is the get page. And here we'll use the client and we'll get a sync. And we will just say /poll. Alright, so we just want to get the poll. Does it matter which one? I think it does. Let's go ahead and get the first one, because on the poll we provide the ID here and we use this ID to extract certain statistics, okay? So let's go ahead and close all of those two. So we're going to get the first poll, the only poll that we saved to the database. So this will be a good idea, a good way to actually check that this voting poll has been saved, okay? Let's go ahead and wait on this, and let's rename this not to get page but poll page, and let's go ahead and say poll HTML, and on the poll page we're going to grab the content, read a string async, and again we're gonna wait on this just so we can see that anti-forgery token and stuff like that. Let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here. Let's debug this. Okay, so here we are. Let's take a look at the poll page. We have a 200. Let's take a look at the HTML. If we take a look at it, we will see a couple of verification tokens for the 2 posts that we have rendered. Cool. So we know the anti-forgery token is here. Another thing to pay attention to is the anti-forgery token gets split into 2 parts. So what I will actually do is I will go into poll HTML. I will inspect here and I'll grab the value and I will just post it here. Okay, let me post it in a string just so we can take a look at poll page. We will go into headers. We're gonna go and find this header where it says set cookie, and for the value, let's go ahead and look at it as well. You will see that the first couple of bits is basically saying, right, set this cookie to this value here. I'm gonna copy the value, and here is just gonna set some options for the cookie that it's gonna set in the state. Okay, but primarily I'm interested of the value of the cookie, okay? So I'm going to copy this, and again here, just besides here, if it stops lagging, I'm just going to go ahead and paste the cookie, and it doesn't take a scientist to see that essentially they are different, right? The beginning may look a little bit the same, but right about here is where they start to be different. So your anti-forgery cookie is split into 2 parts. So when we will need to do the post, again, back to the endpoint, we will need to submit a cookie as part of the request, and we will need to submit another value as part of the form, okay? So there is really 2 things to do. So not to lose track of what we're trying to accomplish, what I usually do sometimes is as part of the form, we will need to add anti-forgery token value, and somewhere here to the request we will need to add anti-forgery cookie value. Natty? Anti. So 2 primary things that we need to do to stop getting the 400 error. Let's go ahead and extract the anti-forgery token first. What some examples can show you is to use regex, or you can write your own parser. I know a library that can be used for parsing HTML, loading HTML, and stuff with to do with web scraping. I'm gonna go ahead into manage NuGet packages, and I'm gonna look for HTML. And what I want is HTML Agility Pack, and this is a very good library for parsing HTML and using XPath to actually traverse HTML. And XPath is an old thing, and it's transferable skill. You can transfer it if you're going to do web scraping with JavaScript or Python. XPath still applies. It's kind of similar to CSS selectors in terms of finding what you want, XPath is a little bit different. It stems more from HTML being a child of XML and being able to traverse XML objects. Okay. Nevertheless, let's what is this? Okay. So let's create a document, which is essentially going to be a new document, and not that, HTML document, maybe HTML document. Yeah. So using HTML Agility Pack, we're going to create a new HTML document. Okay. So this is something like a C# representation of the HTML document, instead of having a string representation. Okay, and all we're going to do in our document, we're going to load HTML and we're going to pass a bunch of HTML to here. Okay, and now we have a object where we can traverse and look for stuff in there. Okay, so it was probably a good idea to record what the variable name is of the anti-forgery token, but essentially let's go ahead and see how we can use this. Okay, so there's a bunch of tutorials on the internet about XPath, but essentially, first of all, I'll just go ahead and grab all the forms. So in my document, I want to grab the document node, so that's going to be the parent node of all the documents. So it's going to inherit from HTML node, and all the other nodes like input form in HTML Agility Pack essentially inherit from HTML node, right? And then we want to select nodes, and this is where we're going to provide the XPath in its string notation, right? So slash is this is a little bit like local and not local directory. So here, when I say 2 slashes, I essentially say anywhere on the document, go ahead and find me a form. Okay, so let's go ahead and debug this again, because I will need to grab the name of the field where the token is being rendered, right? Okay. So here I'm expecting 2 forms, okay, and I have 2 forms. I can expand the result. I can see the first form, I can see the HTML for it, and I can see to what it belongs to. And primarily thing that I was interested in is this input field with the name __ request verification token, okay. So I can go ahead and grab this, and what I will do is I will essentially say that I want my input field equals document node, select node, and for the node that I'm going to select, this is essentially selects the first XML node that matches the XPath. Okay, so for the XPath, what I'm going to supply is anywhere, just find me an input field, right, where the name attribute is going to equal to __ request verification token. Okay. So here I have my input field. Let's go ahead and see what it looks like, right? When you're dealing with new technology, it's always good to just run this again and again and again in debug mode and see what it consists of, or read the documentation. It's not going to be like you import a package and you instantly can use it. It's always a slow and grueling learning process when you first start off, and I'd recommend always debug to really understand what's happening. So we have the input field. If we go in here, we will be able to find the attributes field, which is really what the name and the value and the class are. It's just a bunch of attribute values where we'll be able to see 3 attributes. So the name, type, value, and really we're after the value attribute right here. Okay, so we want to get this value. Okay, and there's even a convenient function like get attribute value of certain type. So we want to get a string, and the attribute that we're after is the value attribute. And another thing that this function expects as a default value. So what you can say is, let's provide a string as the default value if this value is not found, or we can just straight up provide default. Okay, but I'd rather say a string because you don't know what default is until you look here, but here you can see that it's an empty string. Okay, let's go ahead and quickly rerun this debugging session so we can essentially see that we are indeed getting our verification token from the input field. Okay, so the input field is now the verification token value, so we can take a look at it, and here it is in all its glory. Okay, so let's go ahead and rename this as verification token. And we can see its name right here, and this is what we can put it here as the key value pair, so another key value pair. Let's go ahead and disable this little red breaking point. I feel like it's distracting a little bit. So we got the string, we can provide the name, and then we can provide the verification token. And again, I'm going to remove the comment. I'm just going to reiterate that these functions, right, for example, like finding the request verification token, even though we have it in this function right here, it can be extracted into a different function. But again, if you made it this far into the video, I'm going to assume if you want to be learning about integration testing, you already sort of know how to clean up your code and stuff like that. If you don't, I highly recommend you learn how to do that. We will also do that at the end of the video as well for this test. Okay, so we're passing the request verification token as a parameter of the form. Let's go ahead and now extract our anti-forgery cookie value. Okay, so again, I'm just going to go ahead and pop a breakpoint here, and that's because I want to inspect the poll page and I want to see what I'm dealing with in terms of the response that I get. How do I get this cookie value? So let's go ahead and debug these tests. So in the poll page, in the headers, I will have a list of headers, and I will have the set cookie header. Okay, so let's go ahead and pinpoint this so we can take a look at it here. Okay, there's a long boy right there, but never mind. So first of all, we want to be able to grab our set cookie header. So let's go ahead and we first want to get set cookie header. In that header, we're going to have a value. Okay, so what we will do is we will just grab this value, and for our second job, we will need to extract value from header. Boom. Okay, so here we will essentially see what the header value will look like. So this gives us a chance to essentially dissect this string and try to extract the value after this equals sign, which you already might understand how to do based on operations with a string. Okay, so let's go ahead and get the header. So var header equals poll page response headers, and we will get values where we're gonna look for set cookie header. So we've copied that, we know what cookie we're after. And one thing is, this is going to be an enumerable. I know I only want one, so I'm gonna go ahead and select the first one. Okay, and again, depending on how many cookies the page returns, if it's like a page that's gonna set 2 cookies, you might want to filter this further down, right? So use your own knowledge about what's happening. So once we have the header, this is essentially this string that we're gonna get here. So let's go ahead and rename this to header value, and this is going to contain this string. So for the string, I'm just gonna quickly drop it down here, and maybe if I zoom out a little bit to get an idea of what it essentially is. It's separated by these semicolons. So this is what we can do. We can split it by semicolons, and we can essentially grab what comes after the equal sign after that. Okay, so just make sure you understand what data you're working with. Okay, so I'm gonna zoom back in, and let's say cookie token. For the header value, I'm gonna split it with semicolons, so I'm gonna get a bunch of semicolons. I'm gonna grab the first value, I'm going to split it again by the equals, and I'm gonna grab the last value here. Okay, what we're gonna do though is we are gonna put a breakpoint here. We're gonna delete all of this, and we're gonna make sure that we are indeed getting the cookie token here so we can attach it to our request. And again, keep in mind, same as grabbing a token from the form or from the cookie, these are repeatable tasks. You can export them into separate functions. Okay, not running like that. Let's go ahead, right click, debug tests. Okay, so here we are. This window right here, no longer really needed, so I'm going to close it. Let's go ahead and take a look at the cookie token. So it's here. I'm going to grab this value. I'm going to jump to my form here. I'm going to press F5 to jump to there. I'm going to put the token in little quotes. And what I will do is I will look at the verification token from the HTML form. And again, I'm going to put it in quotes right here, just to understand that these are indeed different values that I'm grabbing. Okay, So they are different. I'm kind of in the same place where I'm like, right, I am grabbing the correct values from the cookie and the form. Let's go ahead and attach them. So instead of making a post async here, we kind of want to build our request. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a request. Let's go ahead and create an HTTP request message, where part of the constructor we can supply the HTTP method and the string request URI, right? So for the HTTP method, we can say post, and here we want to submit it to the poll. And for ID1, I think that doesn't really matter because it's only when displaying that page we need the ID. We don't really need it when posting, okay? So this is where we are essentially want our request to go. Let's attach the form to our request. So we have this form. So for request content, this is that HTTP content. We can go ahead and attach the form URL and code content instead of passing it here. Now let's go ahead and attach the cookie. So in our request here, we're going to go into headers, and we're going to add a cookie. So a cookie is just a header value, okay? And all we're going to do is we're going to add a cookie where, this is the tricky bit, we will need the name of cookie, which will equal to the cookie value. Okay, so let's go ahead and pop the cookie value into here, and we'll say cookie token. And now we will go ahead and send async our request. Let's go ahead and bulk this together and separate this a little bit. Maybe put this here a little bit like this and remove this HTML. We don't really need this HTML, nor do we need this assert at the moment. What I want to know right now is, actually let's remove this form as well. What I want to know right now is the name of the cookie, and I'm going to show you how to perhaps simplify these form names for your tests, etc. So where we have the cookie token and header value, let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here. And again, I will just go ahead and debug this test. So here on the header value, I can see the cookie name that it's setting. So I'm going to grab the cookie name right here, copy it, and I can stop the application here. I can then go ahead and just pop the cookie here. I'm thinking it might be some kind of random generated value, although I'm not sure. So let's go ahead and see if this works. If not, we're going to jump to somewhere where we can control this value a little bit more, okay? Let's go ahead and straight into here, we're going to put a breakpoint on the end bracket so we can take a look at this response. And I'm expecting some kind of an exception because we don't actually have a user login at this point. So this is another thing that we'll need to handle, and we will. Okay, so you can see we're actually getting an exception in the part where we're trying to create a voting poll factory. So we will actually, what we'll need to do is in our voting tests where we are doing the fixture, I'm assuming because when we do /poll in the index page, do we have a question ID? We do. So it's matching the onPost in the ID section here. So it's a little bit incorrect. I don't actually think we use the ID for anything, and we don't. So I'm inclined to just delete it here. Let's go ahead and delete that. And let's go ahead and run our test again, see if it fails again. If it does, we will need to give it a little hand into pointing where to submit it. Okay, so here we are. Let's go ahead and take a look at the response. We get a 404, okay, so it doesn't know where to submit it. So on here, I will have to point it to /1, all right? So just as a note, I'm finding out this right now as well through debugging and testing. If you do specify the ID on here, you will need to respect the onPost function as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and debug this. Okay, so now you can see we had an exception on the onPost because our user is not signed in. All right, this pretty much works. We get past the 400 there. This cookie name stuff pretty much works. One thing I do want to do is show you, for example, how you can simplify this stuff. So before we create the client, what we want to do is say with web host builder, and we will provide our builder. And in here, what I essentially want to do is say in my builder, let's go ahead and configure services. So this function is essentially this function, okay, where here we can go services.add anti-forgery, and this is where we can configure this sort of stuff, okay, but now we're going to be doing it for a specific client. and not moving that there. Configure services, and here we want to give our services, and let's put a semicolon on the end here. In services, let's add anti-forgery, and here we will have the setup for the anti-forgery tokens. In the setup, what we can do is for the cookie we can specify a name. Alright, and this can be a bit of an easier way to write your tests, right? So test CSRF cookie, okay, and now that we essentially have this name, what we can do is, again, we can keep it in some kind of a static class or a static struct where we can extract this string. Let me put a semicolon here, grab this name, and instead of this name right here, very convoluted, let's go ahead and put something we can understand, test CSRF cookie. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this, make sure that it still works. So at the moment, the way we realize it works is we're going to hit an exception of the actual onPost function. So we're actually reaching it. It's just another issue that we need to solve to get past the error. Okay, so here's the error. Again, I'm going to assume it works just now that we're passing a different name. And same as with the cookie name, in the setup we can go ahead and configure the form field name, which is this request verification token, which again we can say something like test CSRF field. Okay, and again this can be a static string. We can grab this value, and here now we're going to be looking for this parameter and submitting it as part of the form. Okay, let's go ahead and run this and make sure that we are still reaching the exception. Okay, so we're still reaching the exception, all good, everything's still working. Let's go ahead and sort out the part where we don't actually have a user. So the way Microsoft advises us to do this is essentially, instead of going through the whole login process and stuff like that, we kind of mock out the authentication. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class at the bottom here, outside my public class, right here. Let me drop this down here as well. So public class auth mock. And again, this is nothing special. This is something I've taken from their documentation. And what we're essentially going to do is we're going to simulate authentication. So when authentication checks if you're authenticated, instead of checking if we're authenticated, what we're going to do is we're just going to create an authentication session. Okay, so for this, we will need to create an authentication handler. I will need to import using Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication, and here I will need to provide authentication scheme options, and there we go. Okay, so this is the class. We'll need to override a few things, so implement abstract class. This is the function that will essentially get triggered when we try to authenticate. So what I want to do in here is I essentially want to simulate creation of a user. So let's go into our login bit, and here where we create the claims, the principal and all that, let's go ahead and grab up to this. We're not going to be accessing the HTTP context. We are going to be doing something slightly different. Let's go ahead and format this a little bit. And do all the imports of the claims and claims identity, etc. We'll still have the claims type email. What we'll need to replace this is with a test email, so test.com, just like that. Voting system, let's say test voting system. You can't see that because my mouse is hovering over thingy. So test voting system, and then identity, and now we have the principal. So now what we want to do is we want to create a ticket, which is going to be used for authentication. I'm not going to go in too much into that. This is just what their documentation shows. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and create an authentication ticket. We're going to pass a principal, and we're going to give this a name of test. And again, the name of test, if we go into here, we can see the authentication schema. And when I explained all about authentication schemas, how essentially authentication has the underlying services, this is part of the services that it's going to call. And when we do add cookie, right here, this will essentially implement its own authentication handler and is going to do its own thing. This is just the way we do it. We're going to do it for this test. And here what we want to do is we want to return something from this task. So we're going to go task from result, and we're going to grab the authenticate result. If we go into authenticate result, we're going to see a couple of functions where we can either return a successful result or not. And we need to pass this ticket that we just created. Okay, and this ticket is for this specific schema. So let's go ahead and pass success. We don't ever want this to fail. What we're doing here is we're essentially mocking out a sign-in session. So if someone's signed in, this is what we want to happen. Another thing that we want is we want to generate a constructor in here. So this is just a bunch of stuff that will need to be passed into the authentication handler and authmock, just something that Microsoft wants. We can format this a little bit, and there it is, just like that. Okay, so we have our authentication mock. Let's go ahead and create our essentially add authentication and add this as a schema to be used. The way that we add authentication in our startup right here, let's go ahead, copy these 2 lines, and we're going to put this here. And now, essentially, what we're going to do is instead of having a dedicated service that somebody else has built, we're going to add a schema. So this is going to be a custom schema, which the add cookie would implement this same function, but with their own default cookie schema. And we can wrap this with something like add test authentication or something like that, where in the test function, it will implementing this authentication schema with this function, all right? But essentially what we want to pass here is the options, authentication schema options, right here, and the test auth, what did we call it? Authmock into here, and we want to give it a name, okay? And we're gonna just say test, and another thing that it expects us to pass is some options, which we don't have any of. So let's go ahead and just provide an empty function here. We can even discard the options here. We create our own authentication schema, and all this schema is essentially doing is it's going to create a identity and successfully authenticate it if it's not already there. That's all this is doing. And then we're adding it to our services. And now all we want to do is essentially add an authentication header to all the requests. So the way you would do this is you would specify your default request headers on your client, and you would go into your authorization header value, okay, and this will automatically know where to put this. So we can create a new authentication header value. Let's remove the namespace and import it rather. So let's remove this much using, and here we're just going to specify the schema of test. So for now, all of our requests, we're going to have the authorization header attached, and it will essentially sign in this user or get this user for every request. Okay. Finally, the promised land. Let's go ahead and run this test and see what we get in the response. Let's go ahead and debug tests. Okay, so it appears we still don't have the user. Let's go ahead and check out what is happening, and the error is right here. We're essentially saying, right, for our default authentication schema, use the cookie. We don't have the cookie authentication schema here. Let's go ahead and use test, right? So let's go ahead and stop this and rerun this. Okay, so here we have the response. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. We get a 200. I don't think I can essentially see the contents here. So let's go ahead and take a look at not the headers. I won't be able to see the content, so let's go ahead and rerun this and see the contents. That's what we want. Content equals response content read a string async. Let's go ahead and wait on this, and again let's run this and see what is happening. Okay, so let's take a look at the content. We're going to inspect this, and we're going to see that we have actually voted for counter 1, which is essentially what we wanted to do, right? So now what we can do, we can go ahead and use the HTML document bit again, but here on the end, and traverse the HTML and get certain things that we want from our HTML, make sure that it's outputting. If you want to write these sort of tests, I usually don't write these tests at all, but again, if you're interested in this sort of thing, this is how you do it. And again, here we can do stuff with our database. So we can grab our database, we can put it here, and we can run the same sort of tests. So the testing clause that we have written here for this one, this third one, you can put it behind the function and reuse it here as well. So let's go ahead and put this here. And we will need to grab this context. So let's go ahead and create this context right here and make sure that we're grabbing this context. The email will be different. The email will be, or rather the user ID will be the user ID that we're specifying here. For include, we will need to include the namespace of Entity Framework Core. Okay, so this is essentially kind of the same thing that we're doing here. So we can extract that into a separate function. I guess I can show you how to do that in a second. But yeah, let's go ahead and run this test as part of our whole test suite. I'll pin this here, and I'm just gonna go ahead and run all tests. Okay, so all the tests are passing. Again, this is a good test, and as always, you can grab this content, you can put it into this HTML document, you can traverse the tree. I would just say something like assert equal 200. Yeah, we got a success, and then or rather not HTTP response or HTTP code. Maybe let's see with the response. The status code is of type HTTP status code. So let's grab our HTTP status code right here, and we will rather do the import. Let's go ahead and grab our using statement, return OK, and put a semicolon here, right? So you can test against the response, and you can test against the stuff that you get in the database. Let's go ahead and try to clean this up a little bit. I will collapse this, and the very first thing is the function regarding the access to the database. So let's go ahead and in here we'll create a public void, and you can make this task, but essentially we'll say something like action database, where we will have an action where we will use our opdb context to do the setup. Okay, so we're going to do something to set up our database. So let's go ahead, grab this using statement, put it here. We can also provide the factory in here, but essentially now all that we're doing is we're going to be grabbing this part, and we're going to action database, where we're going to have our context, and now as part of the function we can do our setup here. Okay, and this is something that we can reuse. For the setup, this is not really an action, this is not really a setup, this is rather an action where we're going to supply our context into. And we can not only do setups in here, we can also do asserts. So for stuff like this, we can action database, context, and replace this bit with this. Okay, so we no longer need to use this using statement, we can use a lambda function to do something with the database. For this clause right here, let's go ahead and for voting system tests, let's go ahead and create a public static void, because really the assert is going to throw an exception, so we don't really need to return anything. What we want to do is assert voted for counter, okay, and then we're going to provide the counter ID and user ID. Okay, so int counter ID, and let's provide the user ID. Okay, and here we're going to grab this assert bit, we're going to pop it in here. For the context, we will need to supply the context as well, so let's go ahead and put the db context in here and supply the context here. Okay, user ID, let's go ahead, pop the user ID here. Counter ID, pop the counter ID here, and replace the counter ID here as well. Okay, so assert voted for counter. Again, this can be extracted into a static class. I would rather have it as part of the class where the primary logic for testing this is present. Okay, so assert voted for counter, we can pass the context here, we can pass the user ID, which is user, and we can pass the counter ID, which is 1. And we can do the same thing for this test up here, right? So we can just go ahead, remove this bit here, and put this here. And same for the voting test. So here where we action database, let's go ahead, whoa, somehow I lost it, assert voted for counter, we can pass the context, we can grab the test com thing, put this here, and remove this bit here. Okay, and one thing we'll need to do is grab this class, put it here, and again we will need to help it. We'll need to help it a little bit because of the namespace. This class is sort of the same name, so we can grab voting system.ui. We can create an alias. So using not tests here, or what namespace is this in? Integration.tests, tests, voting tests. Okay, so we got the type, and now what we want to do, base voting tests. Again, you can rename the classes themselves, but I'm gonna opt in for a alias here, just in case you will need this method of renaming, because I know for some big test suites, this is the sort of thing that you will need to do. Okay, so what this gives us is a shorter assert. Again, for stuff like this, we can go ahead and extract this into its own separate functions. So let's go ahead and create a folder in here. We'll say something like infrastructure, and in this folder, let's go ahead and say anti-forgery utils. Okay, and this is going to be a public static class, anti-forgery utils. This is essentially what we want to do with an anti-forgery token, right? So first of all, let's go ahead and make a public static string extract form token. And here we just want to, well, not like that. We want to pass a string field name, the way that we provide the field name. We can set it to default if we want. So let's go ahead, before we provide the field name, let's see what else we will need. So in our voting.tests, where we create the alias, we have the request. Where do we get it? So we have the document into which we put the HTML. So we will need the content. So let's go ahead and just ask for string content, and let's not make the field name optional or set a default to something like this with whatever it was. Let's be explicit that you need to set it. Okay, so we will essentially have the poll HTML, and this is what we will need to do, and we will return the verification token. So let's go ahead, grab this, put this here, HTML document with the agility pack and all that. Let's go ahead and replace this with HTML. We will pass the HTML here and return verification token. And again, based on what HTML gets returned, how many verification tokens you have, etc., this may vary. Make sure to adapt this to your own solution. Okay, extract form token, that's what we're doing. So let's do here extract anti-forgery utils. Let's go ahead and bring in our namespace, extract form token, and let's say poll HTML. You can put it in a separate variable. I'm just gonna go ahead and put it here, or actually no, let's not be lazy. Where do I want it? Let's go ahead and var form token equals blip. Grab this value, put it here, jump to the end accidentally. Let me drop this down just because it gets in the way. I'd rather have bigger screen right now. Let's put this form token here. Now we can do the same thing for the cookie. All we'll need to do is have our HTTP response headers. So let's go ahead and grab this type right here. And the anti-forgery utils, let's say public static string extract cookie token HTTP response headers, and let's say we'll have the headers here. We'll be using this, and yeah, we'll just grab about this much, put this here. Instead of poll page, we'll just replace this with headers and cookie token. Let's go ahead and return the cookie token right here. Make sure we name it correctly, cookie token, extract cookie token. And same thing here, extract cookie token. And by the way, what you can do is, because we're now using test SSRF cookie token, you can do something along the lines of, instead of getting the first one, you can do where the string will contain the XSRF token name or whatever. If you have multiple cookies, that's the way that you can handle. But in terms of time, I will skip on that solution just now. I'm just going to clean this up a little bit and make sure it works. Okay, so what's this? Enumerable. Okay, I deleted the first here. There we go. Okay, so extract cookie token. I will now rather have my poll page header here, headers, and we'll say that this is a cookie token. and it's getting passed there. Okay, good. And something also you can do if you don't want to do this, you can pass the poll page content into here and make this asynchronous, so you're going to wait on this. So that's just another way to set that up. You can also go as far as abstracting this sort of stuff depending on how many requests you're going to be doing. Let's see if we use the content anywhere here. I don't think we are. I can remove this bit. Let's bunch the asserts up a little bit. Okay, I will attribute this as part of the setup here as well. This action database setup, again, part of the arrange. Now for this bit right here where we're gonna be implementing our own authentication schema and the anti-forgery pattern, this seems like it could be reused. So what we can do is we can create a wrapper for web application factory and implement it ourselves, right? So you can have a bunch of these depending on what you want as a blueprint for those tests or as like a base setup. So let's go ahead and create a folder. We'll call it fixtures. And in this fixtures folder, we'll create something like a voting fixture, okay? Voting fixtures, yes, there we go. So all we want to do now is let's close anti-forgery utils. In the voting tests, we'll grab this setup right here. And for the voting fixture, this is what we're going to implement. We will import the namespace, and what we want to do now is if we alt enter on here, we're gonna generate overrides, and instead of all of them, let's just select all. What we want to do is grab the configure web host. There's a bunch of things we can grab, but configure web host is essentially same as this web host builder, where we're gonna grab our iWeb host builder, and here with the configure web host, we have the iWeb host builder, and we essentially have the same thing. So there is no reason to pass the configure web host builder to the base here, since there is no real configuration happening there. What we can use it for though is to put this builder into here. Okay, we will need to do some imports. So let's go ahead and grab some namespaces here. For add authentication, we will need some extensions. Let's go ahead and grab the Microsoft extensions dependency injection namespace. I'm not sure why exactly it's not highlighting it here, but this is where the packages are coming from. So if we bring back this change we just undid, you can see the package or the namespace that it's coming from, right? So let's go ahead and remove that again and make sure we grab the namespace and let's pop it here. Okay, so we essentially have our setup. And what I actually realized is the initial base configure web host, we still want to call it because the startup is going to get triggered as the build. So it's going to grab all the services from our startup and it's going to build them here, and then we want to override some of them. For example, like adding authentication service. Okay, so this is still something that we want to do. Also, this function right here in voting test action database, this is something that we can, again, for infrastructure, we can create an appdb context or even scratch the appdb context utils.cs. And again, this can be like a function that we can reuse anywhere that we want. Let's go ahead and grab it, put it here. We'll say static. We'll just need to grab our appdb context and we'll need to grab the factory. So the factory is going to be of type, again, we're looking in the wrong file, web application factory. We want to grab the parent type because the DB context can live in any of them, and this type will be converted to its parent type anyway. So let's go ahead and supply the factory here. You can go ahead and grab the namespaces here, and we can replace the factory here. And for the create scope, we'll need the dependency injection container. And what we can actually do is to kind of ease the pain here and make this a little bit more abstract is, let's say that we just want the services. So we'll grab the iService provider. So let's say iService provider. Let's say provider. And this should just be a little bit easier, not to depend on the whole context, on the whole factory context. We just depend on the interface of the iService provider. Okay, and let's go ahead and clean up some of this namespaces that we don't need. Okay, so now the action database, what we want, since we don't have this function here anymore, And the actual setup, what we can do is let's go ahead and grab this function, cut it out. And for the voting fixture, what I want to do, instead of setting up in this test, let's say I want to test it with this voting fixture being present on all of my tests in that class, okay? Anything that's going to implement this voting fixture, I want it to have this database, right? Or this voting poll record. So here I'm going to grab my db context utils. I'm going to grab this function from here and put it here. And for the action database, I will also have to give it my provider. So services, I can grab the provider from my services, and I can do it with build service provider right here. And then I will just need to grab the types from their appropriate namespaces, right? So now what we're doing is the whole setup for the tests. If we do want to share this whole setup between all the tests in this file, between all these functions, that is what we want to, that is what we're going to do, right? So now we're just going to create the client here. This is not something we need anymore. I think I even forgot to remove when we had the, the action database function, but we can remove it now. The bulk of the setup will be here. Action database, again, we will need to grab the db context utils class right there, and we will need to grab the service provider from our factory right here. We will also want to replace the web application factory with the voting fixture. Okay, so let's go ahead and grab the class name, pass it here, and replace this here and this here as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and pop all these here, and there we go. Right, so let's clean up the imports a little bit. These up here as well. So you can see we got rid of a lot of dependencies, like the HTML agility pack that is now primarily inside the anti-forgery utils. So anything else that's going to be using the anti-forgery stuff, that can implement this voting fixture, or it can be an extension function or whatever. The idea here is that this is some common functionality that we can extract and set up, okay? As well as actioning the database and doing the whole setup for all the tests in our own wrapper of the web application factory. But nevertheless, let's go ahead and run this. Let's make sure we don't actually have any errors. I'm going to go ahead and run all my tests. Okay, so all the tests are passing. If you're struggling to understand this, put breakpoints everywhere and debug everything so you know the flow of the application and what is being set and where. But this will be it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comments section. Don't forget to join the Discord server. Hopefully, I'll see you in my other videos.